What is happening, team? Welcome to another episode of Anabolic Radio, where I'm joined by Borge Fagreli, who is not only a coach with 2 decades of experience, I'm catching up to you, but also is the creator of Myo Reps, which is an intensification technique that you've also probably heard of as DC rest pause sets. And his original background is engineering, but over the years, he's dived into higher education learning when it comes to topics such as physiology, exercise science, nutrition. So buckle up because today's episode is going to be a good one. And without further ado, Borg, I am going to give you the floor. Would you like to give the audience a little bit of an intro about yourself and what led you to what you're currently doing, which is coaching people and being in the exercise science world?
Yeah, thanks for the invite and thanks for having me. So where do I begin? I guess it's a story I've been telling for many times on many podcasts, but it goes like this. I was never any physically strong or fast or anything, and I learned how to read when I was 4 or 5 years old. So I figured out I would, instead of using my skeletal muscles, I would use the muscle in my brain to try to figure out how to excel in whatever endeavor I decided to. And it became important for me. I was inspired by, the usual muscle magazines, Arnold Schwarzenegger, action heroes in the 80s, Sylvester Stallone, Dolph Lundgren, all those guys. And started lifting weights back in high school, actually. I spent a year in Kansas when I was 15 to 16. I was able to start lifting weights back then. I was very weak. I could barely do 135 in the bench back then. So I was really tiny. But just had a passion for figuring out how to make, a muscle stronger and bigger. And you know, changed body composition. It was very fascinating to me how you could apply loading and manipulate nutrition to achieve a goal. So around 2000, I was just out of engineering school. Internet forums started to pop up everywhere. I started writing on internet forums, articles offering advice. People started contacting me for help, and I guess the rest is history. So that's, yeah, almost 25 years ago now.
Mm. It's been quite the trip, I'm sure. How was it growing or not growing? You said you spent a year in Kansas. How was it spending a year in Kansas? Was it quite different compared to the usual environment you typically grew up around and were a part of?
Yeah, there's many differences between America and Norway, but still we're, you know, a very Western inspired country, and we always look to the States for inspiration and adopt their, culture and even down to the clothing style. So some things were very different, but many things were similar. I feel like I quickly adapted and thrived. I was living with a family there, so it was this exchange student program, and got to feel like I was a local basically. So I think that was a great learning experience, and probably one of the major inspirations for. There was this really big bodybuilding looking guy at our school that I looked up to, and it was probably one of the first inspirations for pursuing this at all. So it was definitely a very transformative experience for me.
Mm, I can only imagine. And looking back, I'm sure your younger self wouldn't have imagined you'd be competing and doing all the things you're doing today. And you're currently in competition prep with Cliff Wilson, I believe it is.
Yep.
How's that going? Are you excited for your coming competition season?
Well, I would say up until a couple of days ago, I was only maybe 90% decided that I wanted to compete because I'm going to have to compete in classic bodybuilding. And I'm just at the weight limit right now, and I still need to lose probably 10 pounds of body fat. So I'm going to be perhaps a little small for that my class because of my height. But the previous times I've competed, I haven't been happy with my conditioning. So I believe I will be able to get in much better condition this time. So weight is just a number, and the judges don't judge you based off of your body weight, but how you look on stage. And I really trust Cliff. So for the time being, I'm just maintaining maybe a really slow, lean bulk for the next couple of months or so. And then at the beginning of May, I'm going to start dieting to have at least 20 weeks to prepare. So we'll see how it goes. It's to me, it's not the competition per se. It's not getting on stage. To me, that's like anticlimactic. But it's the experience of getting in shape. The mental game, pushing your physical boundaries. And, I'm going to be 50, so it's very interesting to see how much I can actually do with my body, even at this age, where many perhaps give up at once they hit 40, and I'm still feeling strong. In fact, I would say I'm in better condition now than I was in my 30s. So it's definitely going to be a very interesting journey for sure.
I'm excited, and it's always humbling seeing practitioners put themselves through that experience. And I'm excited to follow along. So switching the gears up a bit, and I'm sure you have been familiar with a lot of topics in the industry that have been popular as of late. And one of those recent topics, I recently had Dr. Eduardo de Souza on the podcast, and we actually chatted about the 52 weekly set study paper that he was on. So I would first like to start there and get your perspective on the higher volume amounts being stimulative for hypertrophy, given, the thought process of maybe a lower volume based approach, Myo Reps, and then we could get in the effective reps theory.
Yeah, I had the pleasure to have Dr. De Souza on my own podcast a couple of weeks ago, or is it 3 weeks ago? So we got to dissect the studies and the evidence as a whole, and just deferring to his input there, he said that they were data collecting from some research on an average of 14 weekly sets, and they had the exact same growth as in the 52 set group. We also discussed the possibility of, such a rapid increase in volume. Every 2 weeks, you add 4 or 6 sets that could potentially have some swelling affecting the results. And again, to me, they had such inter-individual variation that on an individual level, we're still, the conclusion is that we need to figure out on an individual basis how much can that person tolerate, what can they grow from and what can they recover from. Because with every stimulus, you're gonna, whether you want it or not, have fatigue. So it's the unavoidable consequence of training, unfortunately. So you're gonna have to have all your ducks line up in a row to recover from that fatigue that you generate as you try to stimulate muscle growth, and not everyone can. So if you have any constraints on your recovery, sleep, nutrition, stress, inflammation, whatever, genes and hormones will ultimately decide how big you're going to get. So to me, it's kind of silly to try to extrapolate what muscle growth you're able to achieve in an 8 to 12 week study into infinity. So it's not as if we can say that the training volume or training method that provides the most growth in a 12-week study will eventually end up bigger. Because I still think the main constraint is your genetics and your hormones. So it's more a function of, do you get there faster or slower? And since the organism is a system with many links in the chain that can fail before the strongest link, you have connective tissue, you have joints, you have nutrient supply, blood supply, cardiovascular efficiency. There's so many links there that aren't as plastic and adaptable as a muscle. We can get a muscle to grow rapidly. Synergistic ablation studies are, impressive. Not that we have any human studies on that, but based of our physiology or understanding of physiology, I believe we can make a muscle grow rapidly with quite extreme loading protocols. But at some point, and I mean, we even have research on thousands of subjects back in the 50s and 60s by Hedinger in East Germany, showing that those who grew most rapidly, around 12 to 16 weeks, at that point, they started to regress. Not only stagnate, but also regress. And that was accompanied by a lot of pain and inflammation. Now, interestingly enough, that's the length of most studies, 12 to 16 weeks at the most. So what happens beyond that point? And we can only look at, I've been working with clients for almost 25 years, many of them for several months and years. And I'm just not seeing anyone being able to thrive. And, tolerate is one thing for short periods of time, but thriving and having a sustainable volume, to me, is just, it's an interesting proof of concept that you can train with these incredible volumes and still see gains from them in a certain population. But to most, I think it's way more productive in the long term to think like an investor instead of a gambler. So adopting more moderate training volume, which allows you to, since life meets optimal all the time, and you can't always plan for that, you kind of have to be more proactive and allow a buffer of life to meet optimal so that you can still achieve some slow gains. And during certain periods of time where everything is in order to grow faster with the right amount of food and sleep and recovery modalities, then sure, push the volume. But I prefer to think more long-term with way more moderate volumes so that you at least have some room to add more if and when that's needed.
Fantastic points. And I think this is often a huge problem where people see a paper and they make certain assumptions about these chronic adaptations, but it's only really from an acute study. And I also love what you said when it comes to individual responses, as we all have different recovery capacities, and how much stress we're able to tolerate and recover from is highly individual. And I think oftentimes people forget that most research only really reports averages, right? And it's like with a lot of these papers that come out, they never give us a definitive answer. They sort of you ever play bowling, and they're sort of the spacers at the end of the lane that just help us guide our decision making. And so I also loved how you said, our recovery is going to differ based on what we have going on in our life, whether it be, our stress, our sleep, our nutrition. So it's important to get into a position as an athlete or a client of a coach to where you're standardizing your environment, and that's going to make it significantly easier to control the variables that influence your progression. And I've always had the perspective of sort of like, and I've always, not always, but like I remember if I were to look back 6 years ago, I was doing 5 sets of 10, 5 sets of 12. Now I look at my training today, I'm like, how the hell did I ever do 5 sets of a certain exercise? Now it's like I could get the most out of an exercise doing 2, maybe 3 sets. And how I personally interpreted the findings from that paper is okay, maybe for a short period of time, increases in volume may be productive for helping us push the envelope for growth. But doing it consistently over the course of like an entire mesocycle, you may potentially run into issues when it comes to recovery. And this goes outside of things we can structure with our training to augment growth, such as specialization blocks, where we're having more volume of work allocated towards certain exercises or certain muscle groups that we're trying to improve. And I think this goes hand in hand with our understanding of the effective reps theory, which we could dive into, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the effective reps theory stems from the understanding of the reps closest to failure are typically going to be the most stimulative, and that's mainly due to our motor units, are the high threshold motor units and the low threshold motor units. And once we get to the tail end of a set, we're not only tapping into those low threshold motor units that control a small amount of muscle tissue, but we're also tapping into those higher threshold motor units that control larger amounts of muscle tissue. So I would love to give you the floor and hear your thoughts on the effective reps theory and how that kind of intertwines with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, these days it's probably one of the most misinterpreted or misrepresented theory or model ever. It just gets to me, gets on my nerves how often this is blown out of proportion. All it implies is that what you just said, it's the basic understanding of physiology, the Henneman size principle. So reaching all motor units in a muscle requires you to either lift a sufficiently heavy load, and thus you will probably get close to max recruitment from the very first rep. Now that rep range or loading range can probably differ between muscle groups and even level of advancement. So, a beginner is probably more sensitive to muscle growth stimulus, and their recruitment curve is probably more flat. They probably can't recruit all muscle fibers, but they can probably pretty much recruit most of them from the very first rep because they're still kind of just on in the middle of recruitment ability. And you also need to, with the higher recruitment levels, according to the force velocity relationship, to achieve the maximum mechanical tension, which is the primary stimulus for muscle growth, you need rep speed to slow down sufficiently. And that can be achieved by fatigue at the end of a high rep set or by lifting a sufficiently heavy load. So we again see that if the loads are sufficiently heavy, we achieve both high recruitment and high mechanical tension. If the loads are light, we need more reps and fatigue to get to a point where we get into the most effective range. And contrary to what many have misrepresented or misinterpreted as, it's not a hard cutoff of the last 5 reps. I never said that. I said that looking at the recruitment curves for light load sets, they seem to reach the maximum around the final 3 to 5 reps of a set. And at heavier loads, we're probably, pretty much equal from the very first rep all the way up into an 8 rep max load. It seems to differ between individuals. It seems to differ between muscle groups and even exercises. So the slope of the curve will probably vary dramatically, be, steeper or what's the word when it's not as steep? More even across reps. And That's why I also see divergence in various studies looking at reps in reserve. There was this recent Norwegian study where they used 75 to 80% of 1 max loads, which I believe is already sufficiently heavy to reach high recruitment levels. They maximally accelerated the loads, which will also increase motor unit recruitment levels. So even though the mechanical tension perhaps wasn't at its highest, it was still sufficiently stimulatory. So in that study, they had the same muscle growth between groups, but one group had to do twice the number of sets to reach the same hypertrophy and also the same total volume. So the interpretation of that is that volume is all that matters, because they did the same volume and got the same muscle growth, even though one group trained with half the number of reps in each set. A previous study with Professor Göran Paulsen, a Norwegian professor that I've been discussing these studies with on email. They had a previous study a couple of years ago. In that group, one group had 4 reps in reserve. They saw very insignificant hypertrophy at 4 reps in reserve on a bench press. So for the upper body, it seems as if the slope is steeper and you need to work closer to failure. And tying that in with the volume recommendations, it seems like the range for effective volume or optimal volume is wider. It's like 10 to 20 sets per week for legs, according to Dr. D'Souza, whereas for upper body, it's way lower and perhaps even more narrow. So maybe 6 to 10 up to 12 sets per week. So essentially, we have like studies all over the place. The study showing that every rep in a set matters, tend to use more untrained, tends to use legs. And I believe that's a major confounding variable, because untrained can grow from walking on a treadmill. But we also have so many studies. For instance, one study, I can't remember offhand who was the authors of that study, but 6 sets of 5 reps with 30 seconds of rest in between. They saw insignificant muscle growth compared to the group doing 3 sets of 10, working closer to failure. Other studies have seen that while you need to do additional sets to kind of make up for the loss of proximity to failure, and so perhaps it kind of balances out in the end. But to me, I mean, that was the point with Myo Reps. I'm not for effect, because we can do many things and achieve the same effect, and that's what I believe we'll cover later. But the Myo Reps study show that you achieve the same end effect or result, but the efficiency is way higher. So you get more stimulation in less time. And so to me, it doesn't make sense to do twice the number of sets just because you want to go easy on yourself. And it kind of fails the real world check, where just look around gyms, see how many guys are lifting endless sets, maybe not working as close to failure as they should, and getting nowhere year after year after year. I've had so many clients come in to me, and we just start pushing them closer to failure and teaching them, recalibrating where their point of failure actually is. And they realize that, wow, I've been working, I thought I was working close to failure, and I've been like 5 reps in reserve for eternity. And just doing a couple of high quality sets close to failure, and suddenly their gains are taking off. So that's kind of, a long-winded way to kind of get to the point where I do believe that we need a certain number of high effort sets, hard sets. I don't think it's a good idea to go to failure if you're going to do more than 2 sets. So it's probably more efficient to stay 1 to 2 reps in reserve, simply because you recover from that faster. It allows more volume, and doing more than 5 reps in reserve, I consider to be warm-up sets, and you're probably going to have to just do a ton of more work, which to me, even if it's less effort, adds up to the overall fatigue and requires more recovery. That's kind of my bird's eye perspective on all of this.
Great points. And I mean, in most of the literature I've seen, rep ranges 5 through 30 are sufficient with regards to producing a growth response, but the caveat is those reps and sets have to be taken to a close proximity of failure. And I think it is incredibly important to also look at this from the lens of your training level of advancement. So someone who's a bit more beginner, not as advanced, they don't have the competence or skill of training to failure quite developed yet, it may be a bit more beneficial for those individuals maybe to have 3 to 4 sets in rotation. This is just off the top of my head. This is just an example. Whereas once someone becomes more intermediate, once someone becomes more advanced, they start developing the skills of learning how to train to failure. They start becoming more efficient with their exercise selection, their exercise execution. Then the training wheels come off, and they may not need as many sets per muscle group per week to stimulate a growth response. So that's something big to really take into account. And I would love to transition into the Myo Reps paper and sort of how you kind of started incorporating this intensification technique.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to 2005, and I knew about rest pause, but to me, looking at the literature and seeing how fatigue and failure affected recovery, this was back in the hypertrophy specific training forum days, HST forum by Brian Haycock. And we had a lot of great discussions on the underlying physiology, and the HST program is based off of 2 to 4 week cycles where you gradually progress up to your 15 rep max, 10 rep max, and 5 rep max. And it's like a linear periodization model, and spend some of those workouts and weeks submaximally, further from failure. And I was notice a pattern where, because this was a high frequency type training where it was full body workouts 3 times per week. And at the end of every rep max phase where people were, achieving higher levels of fatigue, it kind of seemed to affect the recovery too much. So it was difficult for them at the beginning of switching to every new rep range where those workouts were submaximal to, kind of get momentum going. And I experienced the same thing in myself. Some would also experiment with going to failure or close to it on every workout, and didn't really see any better gains from that. So to me, it started to make more sense to manage fatigue instead of chasing it. And that formed the basis of the first version of Myo Reps, which was just like a cluster setup. So instead of doing a set of 15, you would do 3 sets of 5 with short rest period, take another 2 to 3 minutes of rest and repeat, and then apply the same thinking once you got into the 10s and 5s. But my understanding of, again, the motor unit recruitment patterns, I thought, well, let's get to a high activation level first, and then try to stay there. But in contrast to DC training or dog crap training, which we called it back then, and the typical way of rest pause training where you went to failure on each mini set or the first set and the mini sets thereafter, I thought, well, let's try to stay in an effective range and getting more total volume by managing fatigue. So it's like a very small but extremely important nuance. Managing fatigue by staying at 1 to 2 reps in reserve throughout until perhaps the very last mini set where, it's okay to hit failure, but I prefer to not hit failure. And I just started trying it for myself and then people I was training at the time, and just kind of slowly but steadily spread throughout the world, where now you have like 400,000 hits on Google, and there's like, I believe, 10,000 YouTube videos, and it's part of the curriculum in international training, personal training studies. And Arnold Schwarzenegger bragged about using it in one of his newsletters, and just spread far and wide. So it's been very interesting to see that, because it's almost 20 years ago, and only the last maybe 5 years it's like took off. So really fun to see. And I'm currently revising and updating the Myo Reps ebook based on my last few years of understanding and experience. So I hope to get it out there in the next few weeks, maybe a month or two, and let's see how that goes.
I'm happy to hear. That's awesome how it's come full circle. You saying, oh, I used to look up to Arnold, and then now seeing, Myo Reps and his newsletter. So I'm sure that's very awesome. And cool. So when it comes to Myo Reps, are there any points of contingency that you make on load selection? I know you just said, the first set we like to stay 1 to 2 RIR. The second set 1 to 2 RIR. Third set, if it's within their ability to 1 to 2 RIR, but it's not a bad thing if it's taken to failure. So are there any important points people should be making in terms of load selection or even rest periods between each cluster?
Yeah, I think there's not really a point in doing rest pause sets, or if you do it between 1 to 8 rep max approximately, where every rep is probably going to stimulate muscle growth equally, there's probably no need to it. It essentially becomes cluster training. So you can do mini sets with short rest periods in between if you want to. That's been shown in some studies to improve power outcomes, and probably equally good for hypertrophy, and probably more effective for power and strength, having more reps in reserve on each set of mini sets. And I also think that beyond 20 reps, it tends to become so exhausting and it's so uncomfortable that the goal is maximum motor unit recruitment. And due to the perception of effort and subjective experience of all the burning sensations, I believe it will reduce motor unit recruitment at some level, or be limited by your cardiovascular efficiency. Everyone that's ever done, a Myo Rep set on Bulgarian split squats will certainly understand that. And if you haven't, let that be an interesting experiment. Remember to keep a bucket nearby. And so I definitely think, for practical reasons and cardiovascular reasons, 8 to 15 reps is a good range for the activation set. I like auto-regulating the additional volume. So I just pick something between 3 to 5 or maybe 2 to 5 reps. At least if you're starting off an activation set at 8 reps, I think on some muscle groups and for some individuals, doing the mini sets of 2 reps is probably better than 3. But 3 to 5 reps in each mini set, 3 to 5 deep breaths, perhaps slightly more. You kind of go by feel after, with some experience. And once you see a significant drop off in performance, I believe it's a good idea to stop. It just, whether it's your work capacity, fiber type makeup, cardiovascular efficiency, whatever is going on, I tend to see that you accumulate too much fatigue if you go beyond that point. So for some, that might be, let's say, 10 reps, short rest, 4, short rest, 4, short rest, 3, and you almost hit failure, so you stop there. Some, if you pick 3, you might go 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, and I don't think it's necessary to do more than maybe 20, 25 total reps, maybe a maximum of 30, depending on, the exercise and the individual. But try to sort of, again, manage fatigue by staying at a certain activation level or a level of fatigue without going to failure, and just extend the set to get in more work in the what I call the effective range within a certain period of time. And that's essentially what the Myo Reps study shows, that yeah, you get the same effect as long as you do the approximately the same total volume, where actually the Myo Rep group did slightly lower total volume, since they didn't have to reset on each set. But it's way more efficient. They spent 70% less time in the gym doing the Myo Rep workout versus the traditional group.
I can't wait to dive into the paper here in a second. I can only imagine that it's going to reignite some of the debates that people have when it comes to training volume. But something that I would like to point out is you keep going back to the fiber type for certain muscle groups, whether or not it would be appropriate to incorporate Myo Reps. So are there certain considerations people should be taking into account when it comes to fiber type composition or muscle architecture, or maybe the resistance profile of an exercise?
I actually don't believe so. I think the fiber type will dictate how you perform and how you recover. So we know that if you have more slow twitch fibers, then you tend to recover faster, and you probably have a higher work capacity. You have an ability to, perhaps a slow twitch dominant muscle group or individual. I've had like endurance athletes do Myo Reps, and they might do 15, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 forever, unless you just stop them or just shorten the rest periods. And I will have like a sprinter. I worked with a Norwegian elite sprinter. He would do like a set of 10, and then 3, and then 1. So it seems to kind of adapt itself to whatever is going on. But I can certainly make inferences according to how that athlete is used to train. That's going to be some kind of nature and nurture debate. But according to Annie Galpin, it's not just what you're born with, but you can actually switch fiber types according to what you train. They had some identical twin studies, one doing endurance stuff and one doing power stuff. And they saw that, the endurance twin had more slow twitch fibers and the sprinter had more explosive type 2s. So again, whatever is going on there, I don't think we need to adapt much, but I can say that, according to the physiological understanding, a fast twitch dominant muscle group or person will probably have a lower work capacity, see a larger drop off in performance from one set to the next, whether it's Myo Reps or traditional sets, and should probably do lower volumes, and should probably also have like lower frequencies in order to recover. Again, if they're doing low volumes and strictly adhering to that, then perhaps they can have approximately the same frequency, because it's not going to be as recovery intensive. But certainly try to make some educated guesses based off of their actual performance in the gym. And to me, it's their ability to progress, to add progressive overload is, an indicator that the volume and frequency balance is working for you. Whether you can optimize it by pushing one way or the other, figure out the lower and upper bound of volume and frequency for that individual is certainly an interesting experiment, and it's what I based my own training concept on, the last program concept.
I love to hear it. And even the theme of individualizing your structure for Myo Reps is, singing true here. So I would love to dive into the paper coming out of Tampa University on Myo Reps. I've only really heard what, Chris has told me behind the scenes about it. And when he told me about the findings of the paper, I was like, wow, this is going to upset some people, and this is going to, change how they think about Myo Reps. So I'd love to hear from you about the paper and if you've had your hands in it at all.
I haven't actually. I just saw the preliminary data. I know they did the same study twice, two different semesters with a larger group, and actually replicated the results. And from the results I saw, it was the same outcomes, the same results, but the Myo Rep group had like a 30%, 20 to 30% lower average volume or total volume, total number of reps times load, and a 70% less time spent in the gym, obviously, since you're not breaking up the sets and doing longer rest periods in between. And that was kind of the validation I needed. So I had a hunch, at least in the long term, that Myo Reps does something special, or these types of training techniques, and even blood flow restriction or high rep training or whatever, that for advanced lifters may have some benefits for, I can only speculate, but I've just seen this happen for so many individuals for so many years. And they have some interesting studies on advanced powerlifters at the Olympic Center in Norway, where Matthias Wernbom, who helped me develop Myo Reps and is an expert in blood flow restriction training, saw that after a protocol of, they tried both blood flow restriction training, but also Myo Rep training. And even these advanced powerlifters that hadn't really grown much muscle the last 2 to 3 years, that they were, probably for intentional reasons trying to stay in the weight class. What do I know? But after being exposed to this type of training for 1 or 2 weeks, a lot of them started growing muscle again and actually started getting stronger. So that to me was really fascinating, and I was hoping for more, data on it. But it's kind of spread everywhere, and I can only, cross-reference with the results I've seen with quite advanced both bodybuilders and powerlifters, that after implementing Myo Rep training or doing a period of time with only Myo Rep training, it seems to reignite muscle growth for a lot of them. So perhaps it's removing some bottlenecks. Perhaps it's just, increasing their work capacity, recoverability, whatever is going on. I don't know. I speculated at one time that it had something to do with satellite cells. So I don't believe we have confirmed that is necessarily true. But again, I'm a coach. I see trends over time. I don't have 8 to 12 week controlled studies. I just see that, wow, suddenly this person who came to me and couldn't get any results, and we struggled for 6 to 8 weeks, introduced this, and then suddenly we stopped struggling. Suddenly we're getting results again. So it's just happened so many times that I can't just dismiss it because I don't have any evidence in front of me saying that this is so. So yeah, that was my thoughts on it.
Great points. And I think it's oftentimes that the things we implement with our clients is firsthand science, right? It's that trial and error, and then investigating the findings to see if our design was appropriate. And so going back to some of the findings of the paper at Tampa University, I can only recall off the top, I believe they had one group doing the traditional sets. They were doing 3 sets of 10, I believe. And then the opposing group was doing 1 Myo Rep set, and it led to similar amounts of muscle growth. So given the structure of Myo Reps, are there any issues people could potentially run into with shorter rest periods between sets? And I guess this is kind of dependent on if they're giving themselves appropriate time between each mini set to rest.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's very feasible to do on squats and deadlifts. You just run into cardiovascular efficiency problems. You just get too winded to actually train the muscle properly. It's a little tedious on dumbbell bench press and double shoulder press, where you kind of have to stabilize and balance dumbbells, put them down, pick them up again, and get them into position. I also don't like to do it on Romanian deadlifts or bent rows, where the lower back fatigue can be an issue. And obviously, if you're doing 50 to 20 rep activation sets, then that's going to be way more fatiguing than 8 to 10 reps. So not everyone can tolerate that, and especially not when you're using a large number of muscle groups at the same time, going back to the Bulgarian split squat example.
Great points. So I think it would be safe to say that for certain muscle groups, it probably would not be appropriate larger muscle groups that kind of lend themselves to compound-based movements, whereas isolation-based movements, lateral raises, bicep curls, tricep extensions, calf raises even, it may be a bit more appropriate to incorporate. And I can definitely see the improvements in terms of our recovery and just our ability to tolerate a little bit more stress because we're improving cardiovascular efficiency. Would there be any points for the audience maybe going for a certain time period, incorporating it, and then maybe off? Or like, how much of this can we attribute to being a novel stimulus as well?
Yeah, good question. I don't think I have a good answer to that. I mean, I've seen it work really well, just combining it into a program with lower rep heavy training. I've seen it work well as kind of a deload, where you just go 1 to 2 weeks with Myo Rep training. So it's again a very novel stimulus and using lighter loads, but it's still very fatiguing. I've seen people try, to do full body training with Myo Reps on all exercises, and I used to recommend that myself, and noticed that after a while, many people run into recovery problems, especially because it's kind of easy to push into failure. Whether you want to or not, you kind of tend to end up there. At least many people do, because you kind of get like an endorphin or dopamine rush doing it for some reason, because you get the pump, and it's just easier to push yourself. Sorry. And from the research looking at rest pause training and comparing it to traditional training, the study is showing an advantage to rest pause training. Seem to have the rest pause group training closer to failure, whereas the traditional training had more proximity to failure, again speaking in favor of the effective reps model. Whereas the studies where the results were even, they seem to be working at an equal proximity to failure and or using more advanced lifters. There was this French study that was quite interesting, where they used something similar to rest pause training, the 3-7 method. So it's a set of 3 short rests, set of 4, and then 5, 6, and 7 long rest, and then they repeat for a total of 50 reps. And they compare that to a group doing 50 reps in the traditional manner with the same load. I believe it was 8 sets of 6. And there was a dramatic, significant difference or advantage to this 3-7 method in actual both studies. They did 2 studies. So again, something going on there, but it could be that they're just training closer to failure or pushing with more effort. I don't believe we have proved that metabolic stress plays a role, only that it kind of enhances motor unit recruitment due to fatigue. But yeah, I think you can use it in many different ways. It's like a tool to use. You can be training for maybe 6 to 8 week cycles with traditional training, and then introduce Myo Reps for 1 to 3 weeks, go back to traditional training. Or you can, like you said, use it on some isolation movements for target or focus muscle groups, priority muscle groups. So it's I don't have any good data saying that one is better than the other. It's a great tool to experiment with.
Fantastic points. And to just round off this discussion, I first want to thank you for coming on and making yourself available to us. And would you have any updates or things you want to let the audience know about, maybe potentially, your book that you're revising?
Yeah, I can't really say when it'll be out. I'm trying to put some pieces together in my mind first and reconcile some of the most recent data. That's like an ongoing process. I'm an overthinker in many regards. And I also want to kind of include, because I'm going to be speaking to an audience where instant gratification and getting rapid results and this and that influencer and wanting to look like a Greek god, or to me, I've been in the game I've been lifting weights for more than 30 years. And it's a really slow, tedious process where the journey, just enjoying training, means just way more than chasing these instant results and dramatic gains. And again, as I just posted on Instagram, and Dr. D'Souza inspired me because it took up a ruler and showed me these are the gains we're talking about. It was like 0.2 centimeters in a 12-week study. So 2 millimeters. It's minor difference, and we can't really expect to extrapolate that into infinity. That would mean you would be growing a 10 centimeter thickness in muscle growth in the next decade, if that was true. So more of the slow and steady, being more curious about your own progress and how adjusting these small variables here and there, and experimenting with different tools, progression models, being curious, being your own detective, instead of trying to, this new study showing whatever, then jump all over that. It's more disturbing, or it's more confusing to people than actually helping them to achieve long-term sustainable results and enjoy the process. I see so much overthinking in the comment section and the DMs. It just blows my mind. And I
I
know
think
I've contributed to it, so I'm just gonna see if I can somehow inject some small nuggets of wisdom here and there to remind everyone that it's the slow, sustainable approach that works best. So, long way of saying I hope I will get the book out soon, but I do want to make it more aligned with my current thought process around this.
No, absolutely. I love that. And definitely disturbing as coaches and practitioners to see you just get on social media and people are taking the title or an abstract of a study and they're singing it as gospel when you really have to look at the limitations of the study. You have to look at the study design. You have to look at the duration of the study. And just as important as being practical with the findings. And all fantastic points. And I think it is especially important, like you mentioned, to really be mindful of the effect sizes for some of these findings. And I want to thank you again for coming on. I genuinely appreciate it. Go give his podcast a listen and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And go give him a follow on social media. and stay on the lookout for his book to soon be released. And without further ado, thank you all for tuning in and stay tuned for future episodes.
Thank you.